Busy, busy night as always on Sky News. Without doubt, the rolled gold #1 non-negotiable promise of the Prime Minister before he became the Prime Minister was to cut your power bill.
$275, $275, $275, $275, $275, $275.
Now, the reason for this promise was to try to come up with an answer to the problems that Bill Shorten couldn't answer in 2019. How much would the cost of the transition to a green economy be? Now, we all knew this was garbage at the time, but we can't pretend this wasn't the central promise. This is right up there with Tony Abbott saying that he would stop the boats. Yet, of course, this Prime Minister is not going to be able to deliver on the promise. We knew that was the case, but he's been able to generally play home games where the media, just happy that the new Labor wasn't going to repeat the mistakes of old Labor, basically pretended that they were going to be able to simultaneously spend $1 trillion, as the CSIRO told us, to change the electricity grid, but somehow this would bring down your prices. Now, of course, there was a giant asterisk here, which I always said was take the bill from just before the last election. If it's $275 lower than that, then OK, vote for Labor. But the likelihood is it's not going to be $275 for a whole bunch of very obvious reasons. There have not been 500,000 new jobs in the region. Over and over again, you can see the spin that the media put out there. Well, today was a very big day in terms of that promise. The Prime Minister was asked very directly in an interview on Adelaide Radio today about this policy, and he does not have an answer. Now, this should be big news, that the Prime Minister's central promise is now on the rocks, and now he is clearly walking away from it. Now, all of this comes, as I say, from 5AA, the radio station in Adelaide. And I'm going to take a couple of minutes here because I'm not just going to play you the little sliver that may well turn up on a 6 p.m. news, but I want to show you just how much lying is going on from the Prime Minister, who said 275 100 times more than the ones that we just showed you then. It's a rolled gold clear promise. Remember, if Tony Abbott promised to stop the boats and just walked away from it, after 18 months, how would the media react? Well, that's exactly how the media should be reacting to this appearance today on Adelaide Radio. First, the host, David Pemberthy, sets up the interview with the Prime Minister.
Prime Minister, I mentioned the $275 power bill promise. Overwhelmingly, when we told our listeners at 6 a.m. today that you were coming on and invited them to send in questions and let us know what they wanted us to ask you, the number one thing people have been asking in the midst of the cost of living squeeze is, are they ever going to see that money, or is that promise now officially dead?
So, Prime Minister's answer is?
We are doing what we can to lower energy prices, and we'll continue to do every effort to ensure that occurs.
It's a yes-no question. And when the Prime Minister uses anything other than yes or no, then you know that he is walking away from yes. This is as central a promise a politician has ever made in Australian politics. They claimed they had the modelling, they claimed they had the detail, and this was the promise that helped convince Australians that after wanting to break up with the previous government, that this was a government that they could trust with Australia's future. Again, no answer. So, David tries again.
It just doesn't feel like the vaunted benefits of this bold renewables future are trickling down in bill form to our listeners yet.
Because what we had was a war that led to, the Russian invasion of Ukraine led to a massive global spike.
Now, I'll get to the Ukraine stuff in a second. But again, the Prime Minister is clearly on the hook. The listeners of 5AA, the viewers of this program, and every Australian who participated in the last election needs to know, will 275 happen? Now, remember what the promise was. By 2025, $275. We're now making our way through 2024. There could be an election as early as this year, but most likely there might be one as late as the first few months of next year. So whether this promise gets delivered or not is the line in the sand. So the Prime Minister, again, wobbles around, doesn't answer, and here we go for a third time.
So is that why the check's not in the mail anymore, the $275?
Well, that occurred right around the world, and we're not immune from that, and that led to global spikes a lot higher.
I know. I guess what I'm trying to ask is,
occurred in Europe.
Factoring all that in, is anyone ever going to get the $275?
Well, what that was modelling on the transition that occurred on the basis that renewables are a cheaper form of new energy.
Now, those weasel words are massive. Pretending that the promise was based off modelling that has now been blown away because of the Ukraine war. You will have heard this talking point before, but there's a small moment of difficulty for the Prime Minister being able to tell that lie. You see, Putin invaded Ukraine in February of 2022. The Australian election was at the end of May in 2022. So if there were any potential shocks to global prices, the Labor Party would have walked away from the promise. But they didn't. Instead, they kept repeating the promise at media interview after media interview and speech after speech and ad after ad after ad, Facebook post after Facebook post. They were clear that even after the invasion of Ukraine, that the promise of $275 off a power bill will happen by 2025. We now are in the third week of February in 2024, and the Prime Minister has gone on radio in a capital city and is now walking away from the promise. Not just changing the subject, but now pretending that the promise doesn't count anymore because of the war in Ukraine, a war that started 2 months before the election. Now, we have an awful lot of people whose full-time job is to talk about politics. They have access to the keyboard to write the story, the camera to talk about it on television, or a microphone on radio. But apart from that conversation in Adelaide today, this was not a lead story. Now, the Prime Minister may well think that he can break promises and it doesn't matter. But when you promise a new version of politics, breaking something as fundamental as that, and we all know as fundamental as the tax situation was, and I still believe too little too late, tax cuts won't get him out of trouble, but this bloke, how many times do we have to prove is a liar? A liar who clearly used slippery tactics and the low road to get to the highest office in the country. Now, the idea that people will say the promise doesn't matter because nobody believed the promise, well, does that now mean that any politician can say whatever they want in the lead up to an election and there'll be no accountability after it? Now, I know there have been many times when Peter Dutton has tried to ask questions of the Prime Minister in Parliament, but he literally changes the subject. You don't get the opportunity to follow up like that radio interview did. You saw the Prime Minister not just crab walk, but completely slide away and then invent an excuse as to why this major promise will not be delivered. The challenge to anyone whose job it is to actually talk about politics is to actually, now that you've been made aware of this, ask the Prime Minister some questions about it. But of course, it's not as interesting as his many FM radio appearances, which he's been making, where it's all about Taylor Swift all the time. Now, again, the Prime Minister has every right to go on FM radio, and I understand FM radio doesn't work like Sky News Primetime or Radio National Breakfast, where we're going to start to have conversations about how many grains of sand there are. But when the promise is as clear as your power bills are going to go down by $275 and the bloke's not going to be able to deliver it, it's a question that FM radio in capital cities and regional areas would easily ask the Prime Minister. Watch him not answer it. But as I say, no headlines about this today, no follow-up, no features, no headline stories. Instead, for much of the day, people were simply running the government's spin about the vetting process of who comes into the country. Oh yeah, and by the way, about the Taylor Swift thing, well, he was asked by a listener today if he would hand over the tickets that he's got to the Taylor Swift concert in Sydney, and the Prime Minister, well, he kind of showed us the guy he really is, didn't he?
But what if you gave your ticket away to a real Swiftie fan?
Don't, Husey.
Like a real fan.
Don't.
I am a real Swiftie fan.
So the caller pleads with the Prime Minister to say, look, please, 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 I'll campaign, I'll do anything He dodges and says the radio station might be able to give you the tickets. He doesn't give them away. Now, again, I'm not pretending it's a hanging offence. The Prime Minister's not handing over his tickets, but kind of a perfect metaphor, right? I know you're desperate. I know you really want it. I'm the Prime Minister. I could probably go to another one, but I'm going to this one, so bugger you. You're the idiot voter who thought that $275 was coming off their power bill. You're the idiot voter who thought there'd be no major changes when it came to tax policy. But nothing to see here.
Oh, Albo, I'm a huge fan of you, but I'm a bigger fan of Taylor. I would do anything for these tickets. I will campaign for you. What do you want from me? I swear to God, I lost my last ticket to Reputation due to a loser ex-boyfriend who, can I just say, wasn't a Labor supporter. So should have got rid of early.
That was your first
and then he
mistake.
cheated on the
You've got to ask them what way they vote early on.
I know. Young and silly.
Jodie was pretty clear with me.
Oh, really? Okay. What do you reckon, PM? Poor Natalie. Is she a chance?
I've been crying for weeks.
She's been crying for weeks, PM.
I reckon
Here we go.
I reckon 2Tay FM can sort you out.
You are